Ukraine-Turkey strike destroys Crimean rail lifeline, triggering $480 million Russian collapse. Today, a single coordinated strike has triggered one of the most consequential disruptions of the war, inflicting an estimated $480 million in Russian logistical and defense losses, while severing the final functional railway connecting Crimea to mainland Russia. What began as a specific diplomatic confrontation over Turkish access to Sevastopol has now collapsed into a full-scale logistical crisis for Moscow. Two Turkish-built Raider drones, operating in direct coordination with Ukrainian planners, penetrated one of the densest air defense networks in the world, bypassed every layer of Russian surveillance, and delivered a precision attack that destroyed both a major bridge span and the entrance of a critical rail tunnel. The strike has placed Crimea on an irreversible countdown. To understand how this unraveling began, the story must start from the first moment of contact. At 3:08 AM, both Turkish Raider drones were already deep inside Russian airspace, flying nap of the Earth at roughly 120 feet above the black surface of the Dawn River. Their low altitude masked them behind terrain curvature, rendering them invisible to long-range radars and forcing Russian defenses to rely on short-range acquisitions. The mission carried a combined payload of 4,000 pounds of penetrating munitions, enough force to shatter the only remaining railway sustaining Russian forces in Crimea. The operation itself had been set in motion 48 hours earlier, after Moscow refused entry to 3 Turkish cruise ships in Sevastopol. Ankara issued no formal protest. Instead, coordination with Kyiv began quietly, with the shared objective of striking a supply chain that Russian doctrine assumed to be untouchable. The strategic logic for Kyiv and Ankara was clear. This single railway transported between 550,000 and 650,000 short tons of ammunition, fuel, armor, and spare parts every year. If destroyed, assessments indicated that Russian logistics in Crimea would enter critical degradation within 10 days. For Ukraine, this line represented a structural vulnerability rather than a mere transport corridor, one whose elimination could reset the balance of the entire southern theatre. Inside the ground station, more than 620 miles away, Turkish operators monitored engine vibration, thermal signatures, and altitude control. At this stage, the drone's electro-optical systems had already locked onto the heat profile of the bridge from 28 miles out. The ingress remained undetected. For a brief period, the lack of radar engagement suggested that Russian defenses might remain dormant. That illusion collapsed at 3:11 AM. The 96 L6E acquisition radar linked to a nearby S-400 battery detected a faint, inconsistent return. It barely rose above background clutter, yet trained Russian operators flagged it as a potential threat. A Pantsir S-2 battery was ordered to engage immediately. Two 57 E-6 interceptors launched within seconds, accelerating to Mach 4, covering miles of airspace in mere moments. At these velocities, the drones had seconds to survive. Sabre 01 reacted instantly. It deployed a radar decoy, a low-cost emitter that projected the radar cross-section of a much larger aircraft. The first missile locked onto the decoy and detonated. The second missile continued tracking the real drone. With 18 seconds remaining before impact, the operator executed a precise 90-degree notch maneuver and deployed carbon fiber chaff bundles. The maneuver temporarily nullified the drone's closure rate relative to the radar. For 31 seconds, the S-400 system reclassified the drone as ground clutter and lost it entirely. Deprived of target data, the remaining Pantsir interceptor redirected toward the nearest strong return, a flock of migrating birds, and detonated harmlessly. This was the first measurable financial blow, with estimated losses of roughly $20 million in interceptors and associated radar tasking. But it was only the opening act of a much larger cascade. 4 minutes after the initial detection, alarms erupted across Crim Air Base. A Su-30 SM fighter was scrambled, armed with 4 R-77-1 active radar missiles. Meanwhile, high above the Sea of Azov, a Russian A-100 airborne early warning aircraft activated its L-band radar. Unlike the S-400's fire control frequency, the longer wavelength of the the A-100 could see directly through chaff dispersal clouds. It detected the thermal glow of the drone's turboprop engines instantly. The location data was transmitted directly to the approaching Su-30. Inside the Turkish ground station, telemetry indicators degraded rapidly. The Su-30 was closing fast. The drones were only maintaining 130 knots. The battery level had dropped into critical range, and the bridge was still 11 miles away. In this scenario, even ideal maneuvering could not outpace physics. The operators had one final contingency. At 3:12 a.m., Sabre 02 broke formation, climbed sharply to 800 feet, and activated an Azulan electronic warfare module at full output. The device saturated the airspace with broadband interference across X and C-band frequencies, the same frequencies used by Russian fire control systems. Within a second, the Su-30's radar display washed into white static. Its onboard fire control computer crashed. The R-77-1 missiles, moments from launch authorization, lost all coherent target data. Even the A-100's radar feed degraded, forcing Russian controllers to declare temporary blindness. This disruption created a 48-second corridor of electronic invisibility. It was enough for Sabre 01 to complete its approach. Sabre 01 reached the precise release vector. 4 penetrating MMT munitions detached simultaneously, 2 aimed at the central support pillar of the Dawn River Bridge, and 2 at the entrance of the Kavkaz rail tunnel. After a brief silence, the bombs impacted. Their delayed action fuses burrowed deep before detonating. The resulting 15,000 psi internal shockwave fractured the structural core of the bridge, causing the main span to shear and collapse into the river. The tunnel entrance crumpled inward, and the first 200 yards of ceiling buckled, sealing the corridor entirely. A Russian train carrying 40 T-90M tanks, valued at approximately $160 million, was on the bridge at the moment of structural failure. The weight of the collapsing span pulled the entire armored column into the Dawn River, transforming one of Russia's most advanced tank formations into submerged debris. Combined with the loss of the bridge, tunnel, interceptors, and air defense assets, total Russian losses from this strike rose to approximately $480 million. More than 120 Russian military trains across the southern rail network were immobilized, unable to move toward Crimea. Ammunition flow dropped by 70% within 72 hours. Artillery along the Kherson-Zaporizhzhia axis, highly dependent on 152mm shells, fell silent. Ukrainian mechanized brigades used the window to advance 8 to 12 miles into the grey zone, pushing new Russian supply hubs within GMLR's and HIMARS strike range. The southern battlefield rapidly reorganized around a collapsing Russian logistical chain. Crimea had relied on 2 major arteries, the Kerch Bridge and the Dawn River Line. With Kerch operating at limited capacity, the destruction of the Dawn River Railway left Russia with no redundancy. Central tenets of Russian military doctrine, mass supply, sustained throughput, heavy armor saturation, confronted structural limits that could not be addressed by short-term workarounds. Diplomatic repercussions followed quickly. A proposed multi-point peace framework circulating in Washington, based on the assumption of a durable stalemate, was undermined. The strike demonstrated that Russia's grip on Crimea was not stable, but brittle. Now seeing that Russian logistics could be degraded through precision, economic, and infrastructural strikes, rather than attritional warfare alone. Technically, the operation exposed critical vulnerabilities in layered air defense networks. 2 slow propeller-driven drones, operating with low-altitude masking and coordinated electronic warfare, had forced a multi-billion-dollar integrated defense system into catastrophic failure. The cost-exchange ratio heavily favored Ukraine and Turkey, whose expenditure represented a tiny fraction of the losses imposed on Russia. By 3:14 a.m., the immediate threat to the drones had dissipated. The Su-30, still blind, disengaged. Sabre 01 withdrew along a radar-minimizing path, navigating terrain shadows and water reflections until it exited the engagement zone completely. In the next 6 hours, Russian regional commands began assessing the long-term damage. The destruction of the bridge, tunnel, and armored train represented not only financial loss, but a structural breakdown of their southern logistical network. Repair timelines extended into months. Even emergency river transport could not compensate for the lost throughput. By the time the smoke cleared over the Don River, defense analysts had reached a consensus. Ukraine had delivered a strategic disruption without placing a single soldier in harm's way. By day's end, cumulative Russian losses from destroyed hardware, munitions, and infrastructure were estimated at $480 million, a blow that Moscow could neither ignore nor quickly repair. And with Crimea's logistical artery severed, one question now defines the next phase of the conflict. How long can Russian forces endure before the collapse accelerates into a full operational retreat? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments section below.